Hey guys, tonight we're climbing aboard a pirate sloop, somewhere off the Bahama banks, sometime around 1720, and we're staying up through an entire night watch with the crew, every bell, every swinging lantern, every quiet argument settled in the dark, by a man who isn't even the captain. We're talking about a world where a single glass lantern cost more than a sailor's wages for a month, where the ship's bell counted down your life in 30-minute increments, whether you liked it or not, and where the person actually keeping 30 or 40 armed strangers from murdering each other in their sleep wasn't the man with the fancy coat and the pistols. It was the quartermaster, a job most people have never heard of, doing the least glamorous, most important work on the whole ship. Welcome aboard. Nobody's in charge here the way you'd think. Go ahead and dim the lights if you haven't already, and if you've got a fan nearby, let it hum low. Call it wind moving through rigging tonight. That steady creak and sigh a wooden hull makes even sitting still at anchor, salty and close, the kind of sound that carries below decks and never quite stops. You're warm right now. You're dry. Nobody on this earth is counting the minutes until your watch ends, because you don't have a watch to stand. That won't be true where we're going. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. The sun is going down over the water, and on a wooden ship packed with armed men, that's not a peaceful moment. That's a shift change. You feel it before you see it, the deck under your bare feet cooling fast now that the sun's off it. The pitch between the planks going from soft and sticky to something you could almost stand on comfortably. All day the ship has smelled like tar and hot rope. Now, as the light goes gold and then orange and then a deep bruised purple over the water, a different smell starts to win out. Salt, damp canvas, and the faint sourness of 40, some men who haven't properly bathed in longer than any of them care to admit. You'd think, on a night like this, with the heat finally breaking and a light breeze coming off the water, that you could relax. You'd be wrong. The bell itself, hanging in its small wooden frame near the ship's forecastle, is worth a proper look before the night gets much further along, because you'll be hearing it constantly from here until dawn, and it deserves more than a passing glance. Cast in bronze, heavy enough that Corks needs both hands and a bit of a running start to swing the clapper hard enough to carry over wind and waves, it was almost certainly made somewhere in England or one of the larger colonial ports. Foundries there having turned out ships' bells by the thousands for merchant and naval vessels alike throughout this period. Around its rim, where a well-kept bell would carry an inscribed name and date marking the ship it belonged to, this one's letters have gone soft and half illegible, worn down by salt spray and handling. Because this particular bell almost certainly wasn't cast for a pirate vessel at all, it likely arrived the same way most of the ship's better equipment did, taken off some earlier prize along with her rigging, her stores and whatever coin happened to be in her strongbox. A bell, in other words, that started life marking the hours for one crew's honest trading voyage, and now marks them instead for a crew that took the ship carrying it. Somewhere out there tonight, a similar fate may already be quietly working its way toward a ship not so different from this one, though nobody aboard has any way of knowing that yet. Aboard a pirate sloop in the 1710s and 1720s, the day is carved into a rigid system, whether the crew looks like a rigid outfit or not. Bare feet, mismatched clothes, more earrings than any Royal Navy captain would tolerate, and underneath all of it, a schedule as strict as any warship's. The crew is split into two watches, larboard and starboard, and from here until dawn, you'll trade 4-hour shifts with the other half of the ship, on deck, awake, working, while your watchmates sleep in a stinking, swinging tangle below. Sundown to 8 in the evening isn't a full watch at all. It's the first of 2 short dog watches. A deliberate 2-hour stub tacked in here specifically, so the rotation doesn't lock the same men into the same miserable hours every single night. Whoever came up with it understood something obvious and easy to forget. Fairness, even grim 4 hours on, 4 hours off fairness, keeps a crew from turning on each other. Call it the 18th century version of nobody wanting the permanent night shift. Somewhere near the mainmast, a boy the crew calls Corks, not his given name, nobody remembers whether they ever knew that, kneels by a small wooden case and lifts out a sand-filled glass, no bigger than a large bottle, and turns it upside down. That's the entire timekeeping system for a ship carrying the fates of 40 men across an ocean with no functioning clock aboard. Every time the sand runs out, roughly every 30 minutes, Corks turns it again and strikes the ship's bell once, then twice at the next turn, working up to 8 strikes at the 4-hour mark, at which point the whole cycle starts over. Get it wrong. Fall asleep against the mast in the warm evening air, and you don't just embarrass yourself, you scramble the only clock the ship has. Corks is maybe 12. He got this job because he's small enough to squeeze past the coils of rope stacked near the binnacle, and because, 3 weeks ago, he proved he could stay awake through a whole watch without being cuffed for it. On a modern ship, you'd set a phone alarm. Out here, an entire vessel's sense of time rests on one drowsy preteen and a jar of sand. By the time the first bell of the true watch strikes, full dark now, the horizon gone, stars coming out hard and close the way they only do far from any city, the deck starts to feel crowded in a way it didn't at noon. That's not your imagination. A merchant ship this size, 60 or 70 feet on deck, would carry maybe 10 or 12 men. Just enough hands to work the sails and stand a thin watch. This sloop is carrying closer to 40, and some of the larger pirate vessels of the era ran far past that. Bartholomew Roberts' flagship, the Royal Fortune, carried crews that swelled past 150 at points in his career. And Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge, at her peak strength off the Carolina coast in 1718, is recorded as carrying somewhere around 300 men and 40 guns. Nobody signs on for a wage. Everybody signs on for a share. More hands means more muscle to take a prize, and more guns to keep it. But it also means more bodies packed into a hull, built for a fraction of that number, which is its own kind of nightly negotiation nobody talks about until they're stepping over a stranger's legs at 2 in the morning. Somebody, somewhere on this deck tonight, is sleeping in a coil of rope, because there simply isn't room anywhere else. Think of it as the least private group chat in maritime history, except the group chat has muskets, and everyone in it can vote you off the ship. Listen closely to the voices moving past you in the dark, and you'll notice they don't share a single accent between them. Crew musters and trial depositions from captured pirate ships of the period read like a rough cross-section of the entire Atlantic working world. English and Welsh sailors alongside Scots and Irishmen, Dutch and French hands who drifted between navies and merchant fleets before ending up here. Freed or escaped men of African descent sailing under the same articles as everyone else. Occasionally, a native pilot valued specifically for knowledge of a coastline no European aboard had ever seen before. A single gold hoop catches the faint lamplight in more than one man's ear as he passes. A small, oddly consistent detail across sailors' own accounts of the period. Some wore them on the belief, sincerely held by at least a portion of any given crew, that the metal improved eyesight at long distance, others simply as insurance, on the grim, practical logic that a body washed ashore with gold still in its ears was a body worth someone's trouble to give a proper burial. Nobody aboard tonight particularly cares where any other man's accent comes from. Out here, past a certain point, there's only one nationality that actually matters, and it's written on the ship's articles rather than on any king's map. Up near the top of the mainmast, silhouetted against a sky just barely lighter than the sea, a lookout is climbing into position for the first stretch of proper darkness. There's no harness, there's no net. The mast on a sloop this size runs somewhere around 70 or 80 feet above the deck, and the only thing between that lookout and a broken neck is a decent grip and a lot of practice. Falls happened, and they were fatal often enough that everyone on deck knew better than to laugh at a man's nerves before he went up. What made a man volunteer for that seat, night after night, wasn't romance about the stars. It was money. Bartholomew Roberts' articles, the written rules his crew agreed to and signed, preserved for us mostly through Captain Charles Johnson's 1724 account, and worth treating with some caution given how much of that book blends documented fact with dramatic flourish. Reportedly promised the man who first spotted a prize worth taking the pick of the best pistol aboard, over and above his ordinary share. A modern office might give you a parking spot for Employee of the Month. This crew gave you first pick of the weapons. The rope smells fresh and slightly tarry as you take it in your hands. New cordage, not yet gone grey and stiff with salt the way most of the ship's rigging has, and you understand why the moment you see what it's attached to. This is the log line, and the man paying it out over the stern rail, a stocky, weathered boatswain everyone aboard calls Mr. Coyle, treats it with a care he doesn't extend to much else on the ship. At the end of the line trails a small triangular wooden board, weighted along one edge so it drags flat against the water and resists being pulled forward, and knotted into the rope itself. At precise, carefully measured intervals are small marked lengths of cord, evenly spaced, roughly 47 feet apart, a distance chosen for a very specific piece of arithmetic. Coyle lets the board go over the stern, lets the line run free through his fingers, and at the exact moment, Corks flips a much smaller sand glass. This one timed to run for only 30 seconds, rather than a full half hour. Coyle starts counting the knots slipping past his hand. However many knots pass in those 30 seconds is, by the deliberate mathematics behind the spacing, the ship's speed in nautical miles per hour, which is exactly why sailors still measure a ship's speed in knots today. 400 years after somebody first worked out that a weighted board, a length of rope, and a short sand glass could turn a guess into a number. Coyle calls the result back to the quartermaster without looking up from the line. 5 knots, near enough. Nobody aboard has a satellite telling them how fast they're moving, or exactly where on the ocean they sit. They have a plank of wood, some knotted cord, and 4 centuries of accumulated seafaring arithmetic. And tonight, same as every night, it's enough. Nearby, at the tiller, this ship's small enough not to carry a proper wheel, just a long wooden bar controlling the rudder directly. A broad-shouldered sailor named Abrams braces his whole body against the ship's roll, forearms corded with the effort of holding a steady course against a following sea that keeps trying to shove the bow offline. It's exhausting work in a way that doesn't show from a distance. From where you're standing, it looks almost peaceful, a man standing quietly at a bar of wood under the stars. Up close you can see the sweat on him, despite the cool night air, the set of his jaw, the way his eyes never leave the compass card glowing faintly in Grote's carefully tended binnacle lamp. Abrams has held this post for going on 2 hours now, and he won't be relieved until the watch changes at 8 bells, because a helmsman mid-course correction can't simply hand off the tiller the way Corks hands off the glass, losing the feel of the ship's motion for even a few seconds, right as she's fighting a cross-swell. Could see her yaw wildly off course before the next man gets his hands settled. There's a particular, unglamorous kind of trust in that. 40 men asleep or working elsewhere on this ship, and every one of them is, in a very literal sense, betting his life tonight on one tired man's forearms not giving out before the bell finally rings him free. By the time 2 bells ring, an hour into the true watch now, the quartermaster has started his rounds, and you'll hear more about him shortly, because tonight belongs to him as much as it belongs to the storm lamps swinging in their brackets. For now, notice only this. He stops by the binnacle, glances at the compass lit dimly from within, exchanges a few quiet words with the helmsman, and moves on without raising his voice once. A sailor coming up from below, damp with bilge water and irritable, mutters something to you in passing about clouds building low on the eastern horizon, dark and stacked wrong. The kind of shape a man who's crossed this ocean a dozen times learns to distrust on sight. You file it away. Nobody panics yet. That's for later. And it is coming, but not tonight's kind of later. Tonight there's simply a watch to stand, a glass to turn, a bell to ring, and the long, damp, unglamorous work of keeping a wooden world afloat in the dark. Down in the waist of the ship, between watches, someone's got a set of dice out despite the fact that gambling for money is against the written articles on more than one documented pirate crew's rules. Banned specifically, historians believe, because a crew crammed shoulder to shoulder for months at a time couldn't afford grudges over borrowed coin turning into knife fights in a space this tight. Nobody stops the dice game. The quartermaster, passing by again on his rounds, seems to develop a sudden, profound interest in the state of the mainsail. Rules exist. Enforcement, some nights, is a matter of degree. There's something almost tender in that small, unspoken mercy, men a long way from anywhere, allowed one quiet violation as long as it stays quiet, allowed to be human before their crew. Above you, ignoring all of it, the sky keeps doing exactly what it's always done, indifferent to watches and glasses and quartermasters alike. An experienced hand can read a fair amount from it without any instrument at all. A ring around the moon hinting at moisture gathering high overhead. The particular reddish cast low on the western horizon at sunset that sailors across generations and languages have trusted, rightly more often than not, as a sign of settled weather to come. Tonight the stars are hard and sharp and countless, no haze softening them, which most aboard would read as a good sign. For now. Somewhere off to the east, though, that same low, oddly stacked bank of cloud a passing sailor mentioned earlier hasn't gone anywhere. It's just sitting there, patient, exactly the kind of shape a man who's crossed this water enough times learns to keep half an eye on without quite admitting he's worried yet. Corks turns the glass again. 4 bells. 2 hours down, 2 to go before the watch changes and you get your turn below, if the weather holds. Somewhere aft, the quartermaster has stopped his rounds and stands with a slate and a stub of chalk near the companionway, and it's worth understanding exactly what kind of man that is, and exactly how much power sits in those unremarkable hands. Because on this ship, tonight, he outranks nearly everyone. The captain of a Golden Age pirate crew held real, undisputed authority in exactly one circumstance: battle and the chase leading up to it. The moment a prize sail was spotted and the order came to give chase, his word was law, full stop, no debate. Because a ship trying to fight or flee needs one voice, and one only. The rest of the time, the ordinary, unglamorous 95% of every voyage, day-to-day command of the ship belonged to the quartermaster, an office elected by the crew, and answerable to them, not to the captain. He settled disputes between crewmen. He decided how prize goods were divided, and made sure the split matched what the written articles promised. He administered punishment when the articles called for it, sometimes personally delivering the lashes, and he served in the words historians have used to describe the role as something close to a built-in check on a captain who might otherwise start acting like the very kind of tyrant these men had fled to sea to escape. Consider what happened aboard Charles Vane's ship in November of 1718, an episode that survives in enough independent colonial correspondence, not only in Johnson's more dramatized account, that historians treat the core of it as reasonably solid. Vane's crew, cruising off the Bahamas not long after Woodes Rogers had arrived in Nassau to reclaim the pirate haven for the crown, spotted a well-armed French vessel and gave chase, expecting an easy prize. Instead, they found themselves facing a proper man of war, heavily gunned, clearly capable of shredding Vane's smaller ship in a stand-up fight. Vane, weighing the odds, ordered a retreat rather than press an attack he judged unwinnable. His crew disagreed, loudly, and by morning they had done something the captain of a Royal Navy vessel could never have survived. They held a vote. A majority declared Vane unfit to continue as captain, not for cruelty, not for theft, but for what they judged as cowardice in the face of a fight they believed they could have won. He was stripped of command on the spot, and, according to the record, given a small sloop and set adrift with a handful of men still loyal to him, while the rest of the crew elected a new captain from among their own number, a quartermaster by the name of John Rackham, a man history would later remember by a nickname, Calico Jack, for his taste in striped cotton clothing. Sit with that for a second. A ship's company, made up of men most of colonial society would have called the lowest of the low, thieves, deserters, escaped indentured servants, men with nothing left to lose, held a formal vote to remove their own commanding officer for a decision they judged unwise, and then handed the ship peacefully to his second. No mutiny in the bloody sense. No knives in the dark, just a vote, a ledger, and a new name at the top of the watch bill by morning. Try getting that outcome aboard a merchantman flying the King's colours. A sailor who so much as raised his voice to a Royal Navy captain over a tactical decision could be flogged half to death for insubordination and counted lucky if that was the whole of his punishment. The same power cut the other way too, and it's worth pairing Vane's story with the one that produced this whole night's most famous name. Because a crew that could vote a captain out could just as easily vote an unwilling one in. In June of 1719, off the small island of Principe near the West African coast, a captain named Howell Davis was killed in an ambush after being lured ashore under a false pretense of friendly negotiation by the island's Portuguese governor, shot down along with several of his men before they'd gone more than a short distance from their boats. Davis's crew, suddenly leaderless in hostile waters with a fight likely still ahead of them, needed a new captain immediately. And by most accounts the choice fell, within days, on a relatively junior member of the crew. A Welsh-born former second mate who'd only joined the ship's company a few weeks earlier after being taken off a captured slave vessel. A man named Bartholomew Roberts. According to Johnson's account, again worth the usual grain of salt, Roberts himself was initially reluctant, reportedly telling the crew that since he'd only had the honour of being among them a short while, it might be better to choose a man more of their own experience, before apparently reconsidering and accepting, on the reasoning, as the account has it, that having gone this far into a life he couldn't easily undo, he judged it better to be a commander than a common man. Whatever his exact words actually were, the underlying fact of the vote itself. An untested newcomer elevated to command within days, purely on the strength of his crewmates' judgment, with no naval commission, no noble birth, no wealthy patron behind him, is precisely the kind of outcome the office of an elected quartermaster and an accountable captaincy made possible. 3 years later, that same reluctantly elected man would be dead off Cape Lopez, having in the meantime become, by most historians' tallies, the most successful pirate captain who ever lived. A career that started with a crew simply deciding, on a bad night, that he was the best option available. This is the story, in miniature, of the office that made moments like that possible, not Vane himself, who fades out of this particular narrative and meets his own grim end a couple of years later, hanged at Port Royal in 1721 after a shipwreck and capture stripped away whatever luck had carried him this far. but the role of quartermaster itself, the invention that let common sailors build something resembling a government out of driftwood and desperation. The office didn't spring out of nowhere. English and Dutch merchant vessels of the era already used the term quartermaster for a warrant officer who handled stowage, provisions, and the ship's watch bill, practical, unglamorous logistics. Pirate crews took that existing job title and radically expanded its authority. Because a pirate crew had a problem no merchant ship did, it had no legal system to appeal to. A merchant sailor cheated by his captain could, in theory, sue him in an admiralty court once the voyage ended. A pirate obviously couldn't. So pirate crews built their own court, standing, portable, elected, and put the quartermaster at the head of it. He kept the muster book. He allotted food and drink fairly, which mattered enormously on a ship where a captain playing favourites with the last of the fresh water could get men killed of thirst before it got them killed of anything else. He decided who got which hammock space, who stood which watch, who was owed what share of a captured prize down to the last coin, and he was expected, by the articles most crews are recorded as swearing to treat every man's claim with the same weight, regardless of whether that man was a founding member of the crew or someone pressed into service 3 weeks ago off a captured merchantman. Here's the thing about pressed men, since one is almost certainly standing watch somewhere on this deck tonight. Pirate crews were chronically short-handed relative to the size of ship they wanted to sail, and one of their most common recruiting methods was simply forcing skilled tradesmen, carpenters, surgeons, navigators to sign the articles at the point of a cutlass after taking a prize. It sounds like slavery dressed up in nautical language, and in the moment, for the man being forced, it absolutely felt that way. But the quartermaster's ledger mattered here too. In a strange bureaucratic way, a forced man's status was recorded, distinguished on the books from a volunteer, because if that ship was ever caught, and its crew put on trial, a documented record of coercion was very often the difference between a hanging and an acquittal. Admiralty Court records from multiple pirate trials of the period show judges taking exactly this distinction seriously. A carpenter who could produce witnesses, or whose name appeared in a quartermaster's book as forced, stood a real chance of walking free, while a volunteer who'd signed willingly did not. Which means the same office that ran the ship's day-to-day tyranny of assigned watches and rationed food was, in its own strange way, keeping records that might one day save an unwilling man's neck. Keeping that ledger honest was harder than it sounds, given that most of the men whose shares depended on it couldn't read a word of it themselves. Literacy among common sailors of the period ran low across the board, pirate crews included, and the muster book the quartermaster kept, recording who'd signed the articles, who was owed what share, who stood which watch, had to function as much through memory, witnessed ritual, and mutual trust as through the written word alone. When a new man made his mark rather than signing his name outright, the moment was witnessed, deliberately, by 2 or 3 other crewmen standing nearby specifically, so there could be no later dispute about what exactly he'd agreed to. It's an oddly formal touch for a ship otherwise running on rum, dice, and improvised justice. A crew of men largely shut out of formal literacy, building their own careful, witnessed, verbal, and written hybrid system to make sure nobody, ever, could claim later that the books had been quietly altered against him. The quartermaster reading those articles aloud to a frightened new hand tonight isn't just performing a ritual. He's making sure the one man aboard who can't check the ledger himself still walks away knowing, beyond doubt, exactly what he's owed. None of this made the quartermaster beloved, exactly. It made him necessary. Which on a ship this crowded and this far from any law but its own, turned out to be a sturdier kind of respect. A captain could be charismatic, brave, even genuinely liked. Blackbeard, whatever else you make of him, seems by most surviving accounts to have cultivated a kind of terrifying showmanship his crew found more entertaining than threatening when it wasn't aimed at them. But it was the quartermaster men trusted with their food, their fair share, and their physical safety from each other. And it was the quartermaster's authority, not the captain's, that a crew reached for first when something needed settling without bloodshed. Somewhere aft on tonight's ship, a dispute is already brewing. A man claims another shorted him on his cut of a small prize taken 2 weeks back off a fishing sloop, barely worth the powder spent chasing it. But principle is principle when you're crammed this close together for months at a stretch. Rather than let it fester into something with knives in it, the quartermaster will hear both sides tomorrow, by lamplight, with the ledger open between them, and rule on it the way a small claims judge would, except the judge sleeps 4 feet from the plaintiff and has a cutlass of his own hanging within reach the whole time. It is, in its own grim, improvised way, closer to self-government than almost anyone else afloat in the British Atlantic world in 1720 was allowed to practice. Which is a strange thing to feel a flicker of admiration for, standing here on a deck that will, within the year, statistically speaking, probably end in a battle, a wreck, or a rope. But there it is anyway. Even out here, even among thieves, somebody built a system, and the system, imperfect and improvised as it was, mostly held. The quartermaster's judgment extended past his own crew, too, into decisions about the men taken off a captured prize. A skilled tradesman, a carpenter, or a navigator whose expertise the ship genuinely needed, was often the one specifically singled out and pressed, while the rest of a surrendered crew was typically released to continue on with their own vessel, minus whatever cargo the pirates had claimed. Some men, faced with the choice on deck in the moments right after capture, volunteered outright, sailors chronically underpaid and often mistreated aboard the merchant and naval ships of the era sometimes calculated, in the space of a few tense minutes, that a pirate's articles and equal share genuinely looked better than the wage and discipline waiting for them back where they'd come from. It fell to the quartermaster to sort the willing from the unwilling and to make sure that distinction was properly recorded in the muster book. Because he understood, better than almost anyone else aboard, exactly how much that single line of ink might someday matter to the man it described. Not every dispute got the gentle small claims treatment tomorrow's ledger session promises, and it's worth understanding what the alternative looked like. Because it's stranger and, in its own way, more disciplined than the free-for-all brawling popular pirate stories tend to imagine. Personal quarrels between crewmen, an insult, an accusation of cheating, a grudge that had curdled past the point either man was willing to simply let go, were, by multiple documented accounts, forbidden from being settled aboard ship at all. Fighting on deck, weapons drawn in anger against a shipmate, risked exactly the kind of chaos this whole crowded, gunpowder-laden vessel couldn't survive. Instead, the 2 men involved were put ashore, at the next opportunity, under the direct supervision of the quartermaster acting as a kind of referee, and made to settle the matter with pistol and sword under fixed, formal terms, back to back, pace off an agreed distance, turn, fire, and if both shots missed or only wounded, the matter continued with blades, first blood ending it then and there, no further violence permitted once honor had been satisfied by the rules both men had agreed to beforehand. It reads almost like a formal duel among gentlemen, which is more than a little ironic given who was fighting it. Men the wider legal world considered the lowest criminals afloat, observing a code of honor more procedurally strict, in its own narrow way, than plenty of legitimate quarrels settled by supposedly respectable men back on land. The quartermaster's job in all this wasn't to stop the fight. It was to make sure it stayed a fight between 2 men, and never widened into something that could tear the whole crew apart. Even the quartermaster himself wasn't above the same accounting he enforced on everyone else. His slate was, in principle, checkable by any man aboard who cared to ask, and a quartermaster caught skimming for himself faced exactly the same penalties the articles laid out for any other thief among the crew, arguably worse, given how completely the office depended on the crew's trust to function at all. It's a small, structural detail easy to overlook, but it's the difference between a system of genuine accountability and one man simply calling himself there. Power on this ship, however it was distributed, kept finding its way back to a ledger somebody else could read. Bells ring again somewhere behind you. 6 now. The quartermaster closes his slate, tucks it under one arm, and turns his attention to something that will matter more than any ledger the moment the wind turns wrong. The storm lamps, and whether every one of them is exactly where it's supposed to be. The quartermaster's rounds end where the real danger of the night actually lives, not in dice games or old grudges, but in a row of small, flickering flames burning inside a wooden powder keg with legs. You smell the lamp room before you see it, hot tallow, a faint animal reek underneath it, and the sharper, cleaner bite of whale oil where the ship can afford it. Someone hands you a lantern to carry aft, and the first thing you notice, holding it up close, is that you can't actually see the flame directly. What you're looking through isn't glass. Glass in the early 18th century was expensive, heavy, and prone to shattering the first time a wave slapped the hull hard enough to rattle the rigging. A genuine loss on a ship where every material good has to be carried, guarded, and eventually divided among the crew. So most shipboard lanterns instead used thin sheets of cattle horn, scraped and pressed down until they went nearly translucent, tough enough to survive a fall, cheap enough to replace when one didn't. The light that gets through is dim, amber, and a little dreamlike. Everything aboard a pirate ship after dark looks like it's being viewed through a glass of weak tea. You'd think that would feel cozy. Mostly it just makes it harder to see the man walking toward you until he's 3 feet away, which, on a ship full of armed strangers, is its own quiet source of tension nobody quite says out loud. There is exactly one lamp aboard that gets treated like royalty, and it isn't for reading by. The binnacle lamp, a small dedicated light fitted into the wooden case that houses the ship's compass, burns all night, every night, without exception, because a compass nobody can read in the dark is a compass that might as well not exist. Losing your heading in open water at night, with no coastline in sight and no stars visible under cloud, could mean drifting miles off course by dawn, wasting a full day's sail correcting for it, or worse, running the ship onto a reef nobody saw coming. The man responsible for that lamp tonight is a wiry, permanently sunburned sailor named Elkanah Grote, a name the crew shortened within a week of him signing the articles to simply Grote, on account of him complaining, loudly and often, that his share of the last prize wasn't worth a groat, an old, nearly worthless English coin, compared to the risk he'd taken getting it. Grote checks the binnacle lamp roughly once an hour, trims the wick with a small pair of scissors kept for exactly that purpose, and tops off the oil from a stoppered horn he keeps tucked inside his jacket, because an oil supply left sitting in the open near an open flame on a rolling wooden deck is asking for trouble twice over. Trouble, on a ship like this, has a very specific shape, and it isn't cannon fire. It's fire, full stop, uncontrolled, ordinary, catastrophic fire, and every sailor aboard understands it as the single worst thing that can happen to them short of drowning outright. A wooden hull is soaked through with tar and pitch, sealed with oakum, loose hemp fibre packed between the planks. That catches a spark almost as eagerly as gunpowder itself. Add rigging coated in tar to keep it weatherproof, sailcloth, spare rope and below decks, stacked in a magazine that on a well-run ship is lined with copper and kept locked. Barrels of gunpowder that could, in the worst case, turn the entire vessel into splinters and screaming in less time than it takes to read this sentence aloud. The historical record backs up exactly how seriously crews took this. Ship's articles from multiple documented pirate crews of the period specify, in plain and repeated language, when open flame was, and was not permitted, because the alternative, leaving it to individual judgment, had already gotten other ships killed. Bartholomew Roberts' articles, again preserved mainly through Johnson's account and worth the same grain of caution as before, reportedly required all lights and candles to be extinguished by 8 o'clock at night. Any man still wanting to drink past that hour had to do it up on the open deck, in the fresh air, away from anything flammable, rather than below in the crowded, wooden, gunpowder-adjacent dark. It sounds almost quaint, a kind of shipboard curfew, but it's really a fire code, written in the only language that mattered to the men bound by it, which was survival. Here's the thing about a candle tipped over by a drunk, exhausted sailor at midnight in a hold stacked with rope and canvas. It doesn't care whether the man holding it was a volunteer or forced, brave or cowardly, liked or loathed by his crewmates. It burns everyone equally. Nowhere is the fire discipline stricter than in the powder room itself, and the man enforcing it tonight goes by Old Crumlin, a gunner's mate who lost the top 2 joints of his left ring and middle fingers years back to a flash burn aboard a different ship entirely. A wound he shows off with something close to pride, the way another man might show a dueling scar. Crumlin's post tonight sits just outside the magazine door, and his single job for the entire watch is to make absolutely certain that no open flame of any kind, no lantern, no candle, no pipe, no idle spark from a flint striking careless against stone, ever gets carried through that doorway. Instead, anyone needing light inside the powder room uses a specially designed lantern, with the flame sealed entirely behind a pane of thick glass or horn. No gaps, no way for a spark to reach the air outside the casing, sometimes even set inside its own small alcove built into the bulkhead, so the flame itself never physically enters the powder room at all. Only the light does. Men working near loose powder are made to remove their shoes, where the deck allows it, working in stocking feet or bare feet specifically, because a metal buckle or hobnail striking stone or iron can throw a spark just as easily as a match. You watch a young powder handler duck past Crumlin's post barefoot, careful, practically tiptoeing, and Crumlin doesn't even look up from what he's doing, just holds up 2 fingers, the maimed ones, without a word. The boy gets the message. Some warnings don't need sentences. By the middle of the watch, Corks has turned the glass 6 times, and you find yourself doing the lamp rounds properly for the first time tonight, working your way from bow to stern with a small tin of oil and a rag. Because a storm lamp left untended for even a single watch runs dry, and a dry lamp on a ship this size is worse than no lamp at all, it's a lamp someone will instinctively reach for in an emergency and find useless right when they need it most. The stern lantern gets special attention on a ship sailing in company with other vessels, which happens more often than the romantic image of the lone pirate sloop suggests. Pirate crews frequently operated in loose consort, sometimes 2 or 3 ships together sharing intelligence, prizes, and firepower. The stern lantern isn't just for seeing. It's for being seen, deliberately, by design, so that a following ship doesn't lose contact in the dark and drift off course chasing nothing. Some captains, flagship-minded men trying to signal their rank to consorts sailing behind them, favored larger, more elaborate stern lanterns, sometimes gilded, sometimes fitted with colored glass. Because in an age before radio, the size and brightness of your stern light was, in a very real sense, your call sign. Oil itself gets rationed the same careful way everything else aboard does, which is a detail easy to overlook until you actually run out 3 weeks from the nearest port with no way to replace it. Grote keeps the ship's reserve supply, what there is of it, locked in a small chest near the stores, doled out by the pint, rather than left sitting open for anyone to draw on freely. Because a crew burning through its oil supply carelessly in the first fortnight of a long cruise is a crew facing genuinely dark, lampless nights by the 4th or 5th week. an outcome nobody aboard wants to test firsthand. It's one more small, unglamorous form of the same discipline running through everything else tonight. Watches measured by the glass, food measured by the ration, light measured by the pint. A ship that survives this long at sea, not through daring alone, but through 100 small, careful acts of rationing that nobody back on land would ever think to romanticize. There's a reason nobody aboard treats a lantern as a disposable object, and it comes down to plain arithmetic. A decent horn lantern, mass-produced enough to be common aboard merchant and naval vessels alike, still represented a real expense for the era. The horn itself needed to be boiled, scraped, and pressed thin enough to pass light through without cracking. A slow, skilled process. And the metal frame holding it together wasn't cheap either. A proper glass-paned lantern cost considerably more again, several times the price of its horn equivalent, which is exactly why you don't see many of them aboard a working pirate sloop, despite how much brighter and clearer their light actually is. When a merchant prize gets taken, her captain's personal cabin often turns out to hold exactly this kind of small luxury. A genuine glass lantern, sometimes with brass fittings, tucked away among his charts and instruments, and it tends to vanish into the pirate crew's own stores within minutes of the capture. Less because anyone particularly needs it, and more because good light, reliable and clear, is one of those small comforts that money can't easily replace out here, no matter how large your share of the prize turns out to be. Whale oil, where the crew can get it, burns cleaner and brighter than the tallow most lamps run on. But it's expensive and inconsistent to come by this far from a proper port. So most nights, most lamps aboard, this ship's included, are running on rendered animal fat. And the smell of it, faintly greasy, faintly like a kitchen that's gone a few days without cleaning, is simply part of what nighttime aboard a wooden ship smells like, whether anyone particularly enjoys it or not. Fire, for all the dread it inspires below decks, isn't purely the enemy tonight. Used deliberately, on the crew's own terms, it becomes one of their sharpest weapons instead, and the contrast is worth sitting with for a moment. Boarding actions against a resisting vessel sometimes involved crude incendiary devices. Small clay or glass pots packed with gunpowder and other combustible material, fitted with a short fuse and thrown onto an enemy's deck moments before boarding. Stink pots and granados, in the language of the period, designed less to burn the target ship down entirely, which nobody attacking a prize actually wanted, than to fill her deck with choking smoke and sudden chaos in the handful of seconds that mattered most. And no single image from the whole era captures fire used as pure, calculated terror, quite like the one attached to Blackbeard, whose actual name was most likely Edward Teach or Thatch, depending on which surviving document you trust. Contemporary accounts, a wider, better corroborated spread than just Johnson's, including a widely reprinted 1719 pamphlet describing his final battle, describe him, in the moments before a boarding action, twisting slow-burning match cord into his own thick black beard and lighting the ends, so that he came over the rail wreathed in smoke and small flickering flames, a deliberately staged, almost theatrical horror designed to make a target crew surrender before a single shot needed firing at all. It worked often enough that historians treat the detail as more than mere legend, whatever embellishment crept in around its edges over the retellings. The same substance this whole chapter has spent its length treating as the ship's single greatest fear, turned, in exactly the right hands, into the reason a fight sometimes never had to happen at all. Fire has one more way of reaching this ship that no amount of careful lamp discipline can fully guard against, and it comes from directly overhead rather than from any careless hand below decks. A tall wooden mast, the highest point on the entire vessel by a wide margin, is exactly the kind of target lightning finds during a heavy storm, and in the 1710s and 1720s, There's nothing anyone aboard can do about it, beyond hoping the storm passes without a direct hit. Benjamin Franklin's lightning rod is still decades away, first proposed in the 1750s, so a strike on this ship's mast tonight would run down through solid timber with nowhere planned to safely go, splitting wood, sometimes setting the wreckage smouldering in the same instant. It very nearly kills whoever happened to be standing nearest the base. It's the same masthead this whole chapter has already spent time on, the same spot where a lookout clings 80 feet above the deck, chasing the promise of first pick of the pistols. And on a genuinely violent night, that lookout is, without exaggeration, standing at the single most exposed point on the entire ship, one bad flash away from a fire that starts at the top of the vessel and has nowhere to go but straight down into everything flammable stacked below it. Here's where the lamps stop being just equipment and start being a kind of language. A stern light, burning bright and steady, says, plainly, "Here I am. Follow me. All is well." A stern light suddenly doused says something else entirely. And every experienced hand aboard knows it without needing to be told, trouble or deception, or both. Approaching a merchant vessel at night, a pirate captain, hoping to close the distance without alarming his prey, might order his own lights dimmed or hidden entirely, sailing dark, letting the target's crew assume they were alone on the water until it was far too late to matter. It's a small, almost domestic detail. A lantern, oil, a wick trimmed with a pair of scissors, carrying the weight of an entire tactical decision on a night that might end in a fight or a fortune, depending on how well it's managed. One last precaution rounds out the night's fire watch before Grote calls it finished. A row of leather buckets, kept permanently filled with seawater and hung within easy reach near the mainmast, waits for a fire nobody wants to imagine actually needing them for, the ship's closest thing to a fire brigade, checked and topped off as automatically as the lamps themselves. Because a bucket found empty in the 2 or 3 minutes it takes flame to truly take hold of tarred rigging is a bucket that might as well not exist at all. Grote finishes his rounds near midnight, oil tin nearly empty, and pauses by the rail for a moment, looking out at absolutely nothing. Flat black water, no coastline, no other lights anywhere on the horizon. What happens the next time this crew spots another ship's light out there in the dark is a different matter for a different stretch of the night. And it will matter enormously. But that's not yet. For now, there's just the ordinary, unglamorous business of oil and wicks and horn panes. The unglamorous work that keeps 40 men from burning alive in their sleep. Performed quietly, competently, by men whose names mostly never made it into any book at all. Corks turns the glass one more time. 7 bells. The dog has had its watch. The true night is only getting started, and somewhere below, in the crowded, swaying dark where the off-watch crew sleeps stacked against each other like cordwood, an entirely different set of dangers is waiting for the men lucky enough to be off-duty tonight. That thought, a lamp doused, deliberately, to hide a ship from view, carries its own dark echo. Because sometimes the sea doused every light on a vessel, whether her crew wanted it dark or not. The wind hits first, then the water finds every seam in the hull. It's the night of April 26, 1717, off the elbow of Cape Cod, and the pirate ship Wider Galley is running before a nor'easter that has already torn her consort sloop out of sight somewhere astern. On deck, men are hauling at lines gone rigid and useless in their hands, half blind in driving rain, trying to claw the ship off a lee shore they can hear more than see, breakers grinding against sand a few hundred yards off the starboard bow, the kind of sound that turns a sailor's stomach to ice because everyone aboard knows exactly what it means. Somewhere amidships. Her captain, a 30-something Englishman named Samuel Bellamy, is shouting orders that are being swallowed whole by wind historians estimate, based on contemporary accounts of the storm, was gusting well past gale force. Within the hour, the Wider will strike bottom, roll and come apart in the surf, and of roughly 146 men aboard her that night, only 2 will still be breathing by morning. This is the story of the Wider Galley, the ship that turned a slave vessel into a pirate flagship, made an ordinary sailor into a legend for less than a single year, and then, in one violent night, became the wreck that would eventually prove Golden Age piracy wasn't just a collection of stories. It left physical evidence, buried in sand off the Massachusetts coast, waiting 2.5 centuries to be found. Bellamy himself is one of those figures the historical record only half illuminates, the rest filled in by legend that later writers, Johnson among them, were happy to embellish. What's reasonably well documented is this: he was English-born, likely from Devon, and turned up in the Caribbean around 1715 with no fortune and, by most accounts, sailing first as a small time treasure hunter, working the wrecked Spanish plate fleet off Florida before drifting into outright piracy within a year or 2. What made him unusual wasn't cruelty. Surviving depositions from captured merchant captains describe him as comparatively restrained, someone who preferred talking a crew into surrendering peacefully over fighting for a prize he could just as easily take intact. One frequently cited account, again filtered through Johnson, and worth treating with appropriate caution given the source, has Bellamy delivering something close to a speech to a captured merchant captain, arguing that men who served the wealthy for wages were fools, compared to men who took what they needed by their own hand. Populist, almost political language for a pirate, whatever its exact wording actually was. True or embellished in its specifics, it fits a pattern historians do trust. Bellamy built a reputation inside a single year as the kind of captain other pirates wanted to sail under, and his crew grew accordingly. Fast, the Wider herself started life as something entirely different from a pirate flagship. Built in London in 1715, she was constructed specifically for the transatlantic slave trade, a purpose-built vessel roughly 100 feet long, fast for her size, designed to carry both a large human cargo and the goods to trade for it, and armed with 18 guns for her own protection against exactly the kind of attack that would eventually claim her. In February of 1717, on her return leg from the Caribbean, after delivering an enslaved human cargo and loading gold dust, ivory, and sugar for the voyage home, she was run down and captured by Bellamy's small pirate fleet after a chase lasting, by some accounts, close to 3 days. Rather than simply looting her and moving on, Bellamy did something telling. He made the Wider his new flagship outright, transferring his command and most of his crew aboard her, adding additional cannon until she carried something close to 28 guns, and setting his previous, smaller vessel free to another captain. A slave ship, built to profit from human suffering on an industrial scale, became instead the fastest, most heavily armed pirate ship on the eastern seaboard, crewed largely by men who themselves had been forced, pressed, or driven into service one way or another. A bitter, complicated inversion that the historical record doesn't resolve so much as simply sit with. For a few months in the spring of 1717, the Wider prowled the shipping lanes off the American coast with something close to impunity, taking prize after prize, more than 50 vessels captured over the course of Bellamy's short career. By most tallies, an extraordinary number for barely a year of active piracy. Life aboard, in the brief window historians can reconstruct, followed the same basic pattern this whole night has already shown you. Watches stood, articles sworn to, shares divided, a quartermaster keeping the peace between men from wildly different backgrounds, English sailors, forced Africans freed from the very slave trade the ship had once served. At least one documented Mosquito man from the Central American coast, serving as a skilled pilot. Reports gathered afterward from survivors and captured associates put somewhere between 20 and 30 of the crew as men of African descent. some formerly enslaved, sailing under the same articles, drawing the same share as everyone else aboard, genuinely unusual standing for black men anywhere in the Atlantic world of 1717, and a detail modern historians treat as real and significant rather than romanticized invention. Even as they're careful to note it wasn't universal across every pirate crew of the era. Legend has attached itself to Bellamy more thickly than to almost any other captain of the era. And it's worth pausing to separate what's genuinely documented from what later storytelling has layered on top, because the two have blended together in popular memory almost past separating. He's remembered today, in countless retellings, as Black Sam, supposedly for wearing his own dark hair tied back with a simple black ribbon, rather than the powdered wig fashionable gentlemen and naval officers of the period favoured. A small, almost punk rock rejection of the aristocratic style. He's also remembered, in some of the same retellings, as something close to a Robin Hood figure, distributing captured wealth generously and treating captured crews with unusual courtesy. Some of this traces to genuinely surviving testimony. Captured merchant captains who dealt with Bellamy directly did describe him, in depositions given afterward, as comparatively reasonable to negotiate with, willing to let a cooperative crew go with their lives and even a portion of their goods intact, rather than stripping them bare out of pure cruelty. But the fuller, more romantic version of the legend, the populist speeches and the folk hero reputation, rests considerably more heavily on Johnson's flair for a good story than on anything independently verified. And the honest account has to hold both pieces at once. A captain who, by the thin surviving record, really does seem to have been less needlessly brutal than some of his contemporaries, wrapped afterward in 2 centuries of storytelling that turned a genuinely competent, comparatively restrained pirate captain into something closer to folklore's version of a swashbuckling gentleman thief. By late April, Bellamy's small fleet, the Wider and 2 captured consort vessels, the Anne Galley and a sloop called the Mary Ann, was working its way north along the New England coast. And it's here the story turns from triumph to catastrophe in the space of a single night. The fleet ran directly into the teeth of a violent nor'easter somewhere off the outer arm of Cape Cod. The Mary Ann, loaded with a cargo of Madeira wine the crew had been happily sampling, ran aground separately on a shoal, her crew surviving the wreck itself only to be captured soon after and eventually stand trial in Boston. A detail that matters, because it means some of what we know about that night comes from sworn testimony given afterward by men who lived through the same storm from a different deck. The Wider was not so fortunate. Driven relentlessly toward the coast through the worst of the night, unable to claw enough sea room against wind historians studying contemporary weather accounts, believe reached hurricane force gusts. She struck a sandbar roughly 500 feet offshore near what's now the town of Wellfleet, and within minutes the surf began tearing her apart. Survivors from the Mary Ann, watching helplessly from their own grounded vessel not far away, later gave depositions describing what they could make out through the driving rain, the Wider's masts going over, her hull rolling, men in the water screaming, and then, one by one, going silent. Local residents who walked the beach at first light the next morning reportedly found bodies washed ashore for miles, along with wreckage, cargo, and coin scattered across the sand. The physical remnants of a ship that, hours earlier, had been the single most feared vessel on the American coast. Of the roughly 146 men aboard the Wider herself that night, only 2 are recorded as surviving the wreck: a Welsh ship's carpenter named Thomas Davis, who had been forced into pirate service from a captured vessel some months earlier and would later use exactly that documented status as his defense at trial, and a Mosquito Man recorded in surviving documents as John Julian, believed to have served as one of the ship's pilots. Davis stood trial in Boston alongside the Mary Ann survivors and was acquitted, the court apparently accepting his claim of forced service, The same kind of quartermaster's ledger distinction this whole night has already touched on, doing exactly the job it was meant to do, years and a shipwreck later, saving one man's neck. Julian's fate is murkier and considerably darker. Surviving records suggest he was never formally tried alongside the others at all, and some historians believe he may instead have been sold into slavery without ever facing a court, a detail the documentary record doesn't fully resolve, but that fits an ugly, well-established pattern in how colonial authorities of the period treated native and black survivors differently from white ones, whatever the actual circumstances of their service had been. Bellamy himself was among the dead, his body reportedly never definitively identified among the wreckage that washed ashore, which left just enough uncertainty for legend to take root almost immediately. Stories of buried treasure, of a fortune in Spanish gold hidden somewhere along the Cape Cod dunes that circulated in New England folklore for generations afterward. Entirely undocumented and, historians generally agree, almost certainly false. What the wreck actually gave back, once modern archaeology finally reached it, goes well beyond the confirming bell. Excavation of the site, carried out carefully over decades rather than all at once, has recovered well over 200,000 individual artifacts and coin fragments by the museum's own published accounting. Pieces of 8 by the hundreds, cannon and cannon shot, navigational instruments, and, mixed in among the metal and the treasure, smaller, quieter objects that do more to humanize the crew than any coin could. A single leather shoe, a knitted wool sock still holding roughly the shape of the leg that once wore it, a pair of cufflinks, a small folding pocket knife. None of it comes with a name attached. The sea took that information along with almost everyone aboard. But each object is, in its own small way, proof that the 146 men who died that night were exactly that, men, not statistics, each one wearing shoes and carrying pocket knives and presumably, on some ordinary afternoon a few weeks before the storm, thinking about absolutely nothing more dramatic than getting his socks dry. Some of what's known about the Wider's final hours comes, in fact, from exactly the kind of forced man defense this whole night keeps circling back to. Several of the Mary Ann survivors captured after their own ship ran aground testified, in the Boston trial that followed, that they had been taken unwillingly off earlier prizes and pressed into Bellamy's service against their will. Testimony that, cross-checked against ship manifests and other surviving depositions, appears to have held up well enough with the court to spare at least one of them, a Welsh carpenter, from the gallows entirely. The same distinction this whole night has already shown you working quietly in a quartermaster's muster book, forced man recorded separately from volunteer, reached all the way from a captured pirate sloop's ledger into an actual Massachusetts courtroom, and, for at least one man, made the difference between a rope and a released life. The very first salvage of the Wider happened within days, not centuries, though almost nobody remembers that part of the story. Local Cape Cod residents, walking the beach at Wellfleet in the storm's immediate aftermath, found wreckage and cargo scattered along miles of shoreline and, entirely predictably, began quietly helping themselves to whatever coin and goods had washed up before any official could arrive to stop them. Massachusetts colonial authorities, alarmed at the scale of what was disappearing into local pockets, dispatched men to secure the site and reclaim what they could on the Crown's behalf, treating the scattered pirate gold as a matter for the colonial government rather than for whoever happened to be walking the beach that particular morning. It's a small, almost comic footnote sitting right alongside the tragedy. A fortune in stolen coin, taken by force from dozens of captured merchant ships, washing up on an ordinary colonial beach and immediately becoming, for a few chaotic days, the object of an entirely different kind of scramble among people who'd never sailed under Bellamy's articles at all. For 267 years, that's where the story stayed. A wreck, a legend, a stretch of shifting Cape Cod sand that had swallowed a ship along with whatever proof she'd ever existed. Then, in 1984, a diver and treasure hunter named Barry Clifford, working from old maps and colonial records rather than folklore, located wreckage roughly 1,500 feet offshore, buried under sediment that had shifted and resettled for over 2.5 centuries. The find included cannon, coins, and, critically, in 1985, the ship's bell itself, recovered largely intact and bearing an inscription that removed all doubt. The Wider Galley, 1716. It remains, to this day, the first and so far only fully authenticated pirate shipwreck ever positively identified anywhere in the world, and artifacts recovered from the site. Tens of thousands of them, from cannon to coins to the leg bone of a very young crew member. Tentatively believed by researchers to have belonged to a boy no older than 11, are now held and displayed by a dedicated museum, turning what had been folklore into something you can stand in front of and look at with your own eyes. The museum that now holds the Wider's recovered bell and cannon and coin sits, fittingly, not far from where the ship went down, and its stated mission leans as much on the crew's own diversity and the compensation their articles promised as it does on the treasure itself. A quiet, modern acknowledgement that the story worth preserving here was never really about gold. There's something worth sitting with in that. Quietly, before the night moves on. A ship built to profit from human bondage became, for a handful of months, a vessel where formerly enslaved men sailed as equals under a written code, voted on their own leadership, and drew an equal share of whatever they took. And then the same storm that ended nearly all of their lives also, centuries later, preserved the proof that any of it happened at all. Wonder and grief, sitting right next to each other in the sand off Cape Cod, the way they so often do in stories like this one. Back aboard tonight's ship, the storm that took the Wider is still just a smear of dark cloud on a horizon nobody's worried about yet. But the same crowded, wooden, precarious world that made her wreck so deadly is exactly what you're climbing down into now, as your watch ends and you head below for a few hours of sleep before the glass turns again. The smell reaches you before the ladder does, a thick, warm wall of bilge water, unwashed wool, and something faintly sweetish underneath that you eventually place as rot, coming from somewhere in the ballast nobody's had time to properly clean out. You'd think, coming off 4 hours on deck in the open air, that going below would feel like relief. It doesn't. It feels like being folded into a box with 40 other people, half of them already asleep, all of them breathing the same close, humid air that never quite gets a chance to move. Hammocks are slung wherever there's room, not tidy rows, but a genuine tangle. Canvas strung from whatever beam or ring bolt happens to be nearby, some crossing directly over others at odd angles because the ship simply wasn't built to sleep this many men, and nobody's found a better solution than making do. You find a gap between two sleeping shapes and settle in, and almost immediately you hear it. The quiet, unmistakable scuttle of rats, somewhere in the dark. Not one, but several, moving along the ballast and between the cargo with the easy confidence of creatures who know this space better than the crew does. A well-run ship kept a cat or two aboard specifically to manage the problem, and this one is no exception. Somewhere nearby, a lean grey Tom the crew has taken to calling Admiral, on account of the self-important way he patrols the hold, is presumably earning his keep, though not fast enough to solve the problem outright. Rats aboard a wooden ship weren't just an annoyance. They chewed through rope, canvas, and stored provisions, and their droppings contaminated food stores that couldn't easily be replaced mid-voyage. Losing a barrel of biscuit to rats wasn't a minor inconvenience 3 weeks out from the nearest port. It was a real, calculable reduction in how long the crew could stay at sea before hunger started making their decisions for them. Hunger, or the threat of it, is closer to the surface of this whole voyage than most people picture when they imagine pirate life as one long feast of stolen rum and roasted meat. The ship's cook tonight. A broad, one-eyed man named Sowerby, who lost the eye years back to a splinter thrown by a cannon shot rather than any romantic sword fight, keeps the stores in a hold not far from where you're lying. And what's actually in those barrels is a lot less appealing than the legend suggests. Salt beef and salt pork, packed in brine so heavy it needed a long soak in fresh water before it was even remotely edible, formed the backbone of the diet, alongside hardtack, a dense, twice-baked biscuit made specifically to survive months at sea without spoiling, which it mostly managed, at the cost of being nearly hard enough to crack a tooth on, and, more often than any sailor of the era wanted to think about, faintly wriggling with weevils by the time a barrel was 3 or 4 weeks open. The standard trick, documented across sailors' own accounts from the period, was to tap the biscuit sharply against the table before eating it, knocking the insects loose in the dim lamplight, rather than actually looking too closely at what you were about to chew. Fresh food, when the crew could get it, came almost entirely from captured prizes, or the rare stop at an island for turtles, which sailors of the era genuinely valued as a fresh meat source, precisely because turtles could be kept alive on deck for weeks, flipped onto their backs, until someone finally needed a proper meal. Rum, the one part of the legend that holds up reasonably well, was real and plentiful when available, watered down more often than pure legend suggests to make the supply stretch, and rationed by the quartermaster the same as everything else, because a crew that drank its way through the whole cask in the first week of a long crossing was a crew facing a very long, very sober, very hungry remainder of the voyage. Not far from where you're lying, a lantern, sealed, careful, exactly the kind old Crumlin would approve of, burns low near a small curtained-off space that serves as the ship's makeshift surgery, and you can hear low voices from inside. The ship's surgeon tonight is a stooped, quiet man everyone calls Pell, a name shortened. The story goes, from some longer surname nobody bothered learning properly after he came aboard, forced, like Thomas Davis of the Wider a few years earlier, taken off a captured merchantman specifically because trained surgeons were valuable and vanishingly rare at sea, worth more to a pirate crew than almost any other single skill, except perhaps navigation. Tonight Pell is tending to a sailor with a deep gash across his forearm, picked up 2 days ago in a scuffle over nothing in particular, now gone hot and swollen in a way that worries him more than he's letting on. He works by the sealed lamp's dim amber light, cleaning the wound with vinegar because it's what's aboard, and it's known, even without anyone understanding why, to help more than plain seawater does. There's no anesthetic beyond a swallow of rum, no antibiotics, nothing resembling modern medicine at all, just a trained hand, a clean blade, and whatever the 18th century actually knew about keeping a man alive. Here's the quiet, unglamorous kindness buried in this scene. Easy to miss if you're only listening for cannon fire and treasure. The articles most pirate crews are recorded as swearing to didn't just divide up loot. They set aside a fixed portion of every prize specifically to compensate men injured in the crew's service, before the rest was split evenly among everyone else. A documented, deliberate practice, not folklore, referenced across multiple independent trial records and depositions from the period, not merely Johnson's more embellished account. A man who lost his right arm or his right leg might be promised as much as 800 pieces of 8 from the common fund, with lesser injuries compensated on a sliding scale below that, and the money was set aside and paid out before captain, quartermaster, or anyone else took their own larger share. Compare that, for a moment, to service aboard a Royal Navy vessel of the same decade, where an injured sailor's compensation depended on a slow, uncertain, frequently denied pension claim filed with a distant naval board that might take years to answer, if it answered at all. A pirate crew, thieves, by any legal definition of the era, men who'd be hanged without ceremony if caught, had, in this one specific and very concrete respect, built something closer to a functioning workers' compensation system than the legitimate navy their own society ran. It's not sentimentality to notice that. It's just what the record actually shows. Pell finishes dressing the wound, murmurs something low that you can't quite catch, and the injured man, young, maybe 19, clearly frightened, despite trying not to show it, manages something close to a laugh in response. You don't catch the joke either. You catch the sound of it, though. Small and human, and entirely out of place, in a dark, cramped, rat-infested hold 300 miles from the nearest doctor who might have actually helped. That's the thing this whole night keeps circling back to, whether it's a quartermaster's ledger or a surgeon's vinegar-soaked rag. Even here, even now, people keep finding small ways to be decent to each other, because the alternative is simply unbearable, and nobody aboard this ship has the luxury of unbearable. Somewhere above, muffled through the deck, you hear a shout, not alarm, just excitement. A knot of off-watch men who've gathered near a lamp to play cards despite the risk of being caught at it twice in one night. And someone has apparently just won a hand worth arguing over. Superstition runs thick through a crew like this. And cards, dice, whistling, women aboard, all carried their own particular reputation for bringing bad luck. Documented across enough period sources, ship's logs, sailors' own later writings, admiralty depositions describing crew disputes, that historians treat these beliefs as genuinely widespread rather than romantic invention. One superstition in particular seems to have unsettled even hardened crews more than almost anything else at sea. A pale, flickering blue-white light that occasionally appeared clinging to the tips of masts and yard arms during exactly the kind of electrically charged storm conditions that would, a few years later and a few hundred miles north, help doom the wider. Sailors of the period called it corposant, from the Portuguese for holy body, and treated its appearance with genuine dread, an omen of the storm's severity rather than a comfort. What they were actually watching, though none of them had any way of knowing it, was a real, physically documented phenomenon, a glow caused by strong atmospheric electric fields discharging quietly off-pointed objects during a storm. The same underlying physics that modern sailors and pilots now know simply as St. Elmo's fire, and which offered, ironically, zero actual danger to the ship despite the dread it inspired. Fear, it turns out, doesn't always track accurately with actual risk. It rarely does, on a ship or anywhere else. Small, private things move through the dark below decks tonight too. Easy to miss if you're only cataloguing rats and hammocks. A sailor a few feet from you keeps a coin, drilled through with a small hole and strung on a cord around his neck, worn smooth from handling. Not spendable, not really currency at all anymore, just a kept thing. The kind of small talisman sailors of the period are documented, across surviving personal accounts, to have carried in genuine numbers. A lock of someone's hair, a pierced coin, a scrap of ribbon, small physical proof that a life existed somewhere else before this one. On a ship where a man's entire worldly identity otherwise fits inside whatever he can carry in a single sea chest. It's the same instinct, in miniature, that would later leave a leather shoe and a knitted sock behind for archaeologists to find in the wreckage of the wider. Ordinary objects that outlive the men who carried them. The small, stubborn proof that someone was here, specific and real, rather than merely a line in a muster book or a number in a trial record. Somewhere forward near the bow, a couple of crewmen make their way to the ship's heads And if you haven't encountered this particular piece of 18th century plumbing before, it's worth a moment of honest, unglamorous description, because it's exactly as basic as it sounds. The heads amounted to little more than a set of simple holes or gratings cut into the forward part of the deck, positioned there specifically because the bow was the driest, most weather-exposed spot on the ship, letting the sea do the actual work of carrying everything away below. There was no privacy to speak of, no separate facility for rank or standing, which fits the broader pattern this whole night keeps circling back to, the same rough, functional egalitarianism that governed shares and votes and watches extended, without much ceremony, to this too. A heavy sea or a following wind could make the whole arrangement considerably worse than merely undignified, and more than one sailor's account from the period grumbles, in the plain, unpolished language of men who'd clearly had the experience personally, about being caught by a wave at exactly the wrong moment. It's not a detail that makes it into the romantic version of pirate life very often, but it's a real, physical, constantly present piece of what living aboard actually meant. Night after night, for every man on this ship, regardless of his share or his standing. 2 hammocks over, close enough that you can hear it even through the general creak and snore of the hold. A boy no older than 14 is crying, quietly, trying hard not to be heard doing it. He's called Wick by the rest of the crew, a nickname earned from his job trimming the storm lamps under Grote's supervision, and he's been aboard only a few weeks, taken off a small fishing vessel his own family had owned and worked for 2 generations before it was overhauled and stripped for whatever was worth taking. Nobody aboard mocks him for the crying, which might be the most surprising thing about the moment if you'd walked in expecting the casual cruelty popular pirate stories sometimes assume of a crew like this. Instead, an older hand 2 hammocks down, a scarred, taciturn man who has said maybe a dozen words to you all night, shifts his weight and murmurs something low and matter-of-fact toward the boy. Not comfort exactly, nothing so soft as that, more a kind of practical reassurance that the ache does eventually dull, that there are worse ships to have landed on than this one, that his share of tonight's careful lampwork is already recorded fair and square in the Quartermaster's book, same as everyone else's. It isn't much. It's not a hug, not a lullaby, nothing a modern ear would recognize as tenderness dressed in its usual clothes. But it's real, offered without an audience, by a man who gains nothing from offering it, in the middle of a crowded, breathing dark 300 miles from anywhere either of them would call home. Wick's crying slows, then stops. Somewhere above, the bell rings again, indifferent as ever, and the hold settles back into its ordinary tangle of breathing and rats and creaking wood. Somewhere near your feet, Admiral the ship's cat finally makes his appearance, picking his way delicately over sleeping bodies before settling, without asking permission from anyone, directly against the nearest available leg, yours. Tonight, he's warm, and faintly smug about it, and entirely unbothered by rank, articles, or the general chaos of 40 grown men trying to sleep in a space built for a third that many. It's a small, undignified comfort, a cat choosing you specifically because you happen to be convenient. But it's comfort all the same, and you'll take it. You drift towards sleep eventually, despite the rats, despite the close air, despite a stranger's elbow somewhere near your ribs, and another man snoring somewhere close enough to feel through the hammock canvas. Sleep aboard a ship like this isn't restful so much as it's a truce, a brief, negotiated ceasefire between a body that's exhausted and a mind that knows, on some level, exactly how little separates this crowded. Breathing dark from the kind of night that claimed the Wider's crew a few years and a few 100 miles from wherever this particular ship happens to be floating tonight. You get maybe 3 hours of it, uneasy and shallow, before a hand shakes your shoulder in the dark and a familiar voice tells you it's time. Your watch is up again. Somewhere above, the bell is already ringing. The compensation Pell and his ledger represent didn't appear out of thin air. It was written down, argued over, and sworn to, on a specific document that every man aboard this ship, you included, put his mark to before he ever set foot on deck for the first time. Picture the scene, because it happened in some form on nearly every pirate vessel of the Golden Age, this ship among them, a newly captured or newly recruited man, sometimes willing, sometimes very much not, standing on deck while the quartermaster or one of the ship's officers reads aloud from a single sheet or small bound set of pages. The ship's articles, the rules every member of the crew had already agreed to and signed or marked before this new man arrived. He's told plainly what he'll owe, and what's owed to him, his share of any prize, his obligations in a fight, the punishments waiting for theft or desertion, or striking a crewmate in anger, the compensation set aside if he loses a limb in the ship's service. Then he's handed a quill, or more likely, given how few pirates could actually write, invited to make his mark, an X, a initial, sometimes literally a thumbprint pressed in ink, and from that moment he's not a captive anymore. Not exactly. He's crew, bound by the same document as everyone else aboard, for better or very much worse. The document itself, once signed, didn't simply vanish into a drawer somewhere. Some crews are recorded as keeping their articles nailed directly to the mast, in plain view, precisely so that no man could later claim ignorance of a rule he'd broken, and so that the document remained, quite literally, the tallest and most visible authority standing on the ship. Taller, in a very physical sense, than the captain himself. Others kept the pages folded inside the quartermaster's own sea chest alongside the muster book, brought out and reread aloud whenever a new man signed on or a dispute needed settling by the letter of the law both parties had agreed to. Either way, the point stands the same. The articles weren't a private understanding between a few leaders. They were public, physical, and constantly reasserted, precisely because a rule nobody could see or verify was a rule that would eventually get bent past recognition by whoever happened to be strongest on any given night. This is the story of the ship's articles themselves. Not a person, not a vessel, but a piece of paper. And the strange, improvised system of self-government that piece of paper represented, cobbled together by men the wider legal world considered beneath the protection of any court, and built almost entirely out of necessity rather than idealism. Start with where the articles actually come from, historically speaking, because it matters for how much weight to put on any specific detail. The single most complete version of a pirate crew's articles that survives to us is the one Captain Charles Johnson recorded in his 1724 book as belonging to Bartholomew Roberts' crew. 11 numbered rules, reasonably specific, and widely quoted in popular pirate history ever since. The trouble, worth repeating here, because it genuinely matters, is that Johnson's authorship and sourcing remain disputed among historians to this day. Nobody has ever conclusively established exactly who wrote a general history of the pirates. And the book is known to blend real documented material with dramatized invention, in ways scholars still argue about 200 years later. So treat the specific 11-article list word for word, the way you'd treat any second-hand account passed down through a storyteller with a commercial incentive to make a good yarn even better. What historians are more confident about, because it's independently corroborated across multiple Admiralty trial records, colonial governors' correspondence, and sworn depositions from captured crew members on entirely different ships, is that the underlying practice, written articles, sworn to by the whole crew, governing shares, discipline and compensation, was real, widespread, and not merely a literary invention. The specific wording of any one crew's articles is Johnson's best guess filtered through whatever sources reached him. The existence of the system itself is solid ground. What did those articles typically cover, as best the combined record allows us to reconstruct? Start with the plainest and most radical piece: an equal or near equal vote on all major decisions. Every man aboard, from the most junior powder monkey to the captain himself, got a voice and a vote on matters of real consequence. Whether to attack a particular ship, whether to abandon a captured vessel, whether to depose a captain who'd lost the crew's confidence. Exactly the way Charles Vane's crew did off the Bahamas in 1718. Compare that to virtually every other maritime institution operating in the Atlantic at the same moment: the Royal Navy, where a captain's word was backed by the full weight of military law and a flogging could be ordered for a sailor's tone of voice. A merchant vessel, where the owner's appointed master answered to nobody aboard his own ship. A pirate crew, made up largely of men who had experienced exactly that kind of arbitrary authority firsthand and hated it, built something closer to a shipboard democracy instead, however rough and improvised, however quick to collapse into violence when the vote itself was disputed. Shares came next, and the record here is unusually consistent across independent sources. A captain typically received something in the range of 1.5 to 2 shares of any prize taken, compared to a single share for an ordinary crewman, meaningfully more, but nowhere close to the vast gulf in compensation between a merchant captain and his crew, or a naval officer and the men below him. The quartermaster, given the sheer weight of his responsibilities, often drew a comparable extra share as well. Specialists, the ship's surgeon, given how rare and valuable that skill was, or a particularly skilled navigator, sometimes negotiated an extra allotment too, occasionally in the form of a fixed bonus taken off the top before the general division, rather than an ongoing larger share. Everyone else, forced man and volunteer alike once they'd signed, split what remained roughly evenly. It's worth sitting with how genuinely unusual that was for its era. A common sailor pressed into Royal Navy service might go months or years without seeing meaningful pay at all, subject to a system riddled with delays, deductions, and outright fraud by the very officers meant to distribute it. A pirate crew's articles, whatever their author's actual motives, produced something closer to a flat, transparent, immediately settled payroll than almost any legitimate maritime employer of the period offered. Discipline under the articles tended to be swift, specific, and, by the standards of naval and merchant law at the time, comparatively restrained in most day-to-day matters, reserved at full severity for offences that threatened the whole crew's survival. Desertion in the face of an enemy, or cowardice that endangered the ship during a fight, carried some of the harshest penalties on record, marooning, in the worst documented cases. A punishment that meant being set ashore, often on a small, isolated, uninhabited spit of sand or rock, with minimal supplies. A pistol, sometimes a single shot of powder and ball, occasionally a small ration of water, and left there, alone, to face whatever came next. It's a punishment that sounds almost gentle compared to outright execution, and in the popular imagination it often gets treated that way. But the reality, documented in more than one surviving account, was that marooning frequently amounted to a slow death sentence dressed up as mercy, particularly on islands with no fresh water source, no game, and no realistic hope of rescue before thirst or exposure finished the job the crew hadn't wanted to do with their own hands directly. Theft from a fellow crewman, by contrast, seems to have carried genuinely severe punishment across multiple documented crews, sometimes worse, proportionally, than theft from a captured prize. Because stealing from the common stock of a ship taken from an enemy was simply piracy. Doing what piracy does, while stealing from a shipmate broke the one bond holding this improvised, transient community together at all. Some articles reportedly specified slitting the ears and nose of a man caught stealing from his crewmates and marooning him afterward, brutal by any modern standard, but revealing in what it prioritized. Not property in the abstract, but the specific, fragile trust between men who had nothing else keeping them from turning on each other in the dark some crowded night not unlike this one. Then there are the articles that read, at first glance, almost domestic. Rules that have nothing to do with violence or theft at all, and everything to do with simply making 40-odd men bearable to live alongside, for months at a stretch in a space the size of a modest house. The lights-out rule you already know about, the one that sent drinkers up to the open deck after 8 in the evening rather than risking a spilled candle below decks. A ban on gambling for money, the same rule the Quartermaster quietly chose not to enforce earlier tonight, aimed at preventing exactly the kind of festering debt and resentment that turns close quarters lethal. Weapons kept clean and ready for inspection at all times, because a fouled pistol or a rusted cutlass in the hands of a man who might need it in 30 seconds wasn't a personal failing, it was a threat to everyone standing near him. Musicians aboard and pirate crews really did carry them. Fiddlers and drummers mostly, valuable enough that some accounts describe them specifically exempted from ordinary watch duty, given how much a crew's morale depended on them, were reportedly guaranteed rest on the Sabbath by custom. A small, oddly gentle carve-out in an otherwise unforgiving document, suggesting that even men who'd rejected nearly every other rule of the society they'd come from still understood, on some level, that a crew needs more than discipline to hold together. It needs a reason to want to stay. Notice, too, what's conspicuously absent from every surviving version of these articles across every crew historians have documented: walking the plank. It doesn't appear. Not in Johnson's account of Robert's articles, not in any Admiralty trial record, not in any sworn deposition from a captured crew describing how their own ship punished wrongdoing. The image is so thoroughly baked into modern pirate fiction that it comes as a genuine surprise to most people that historians can't point to a single well-documented Golden Age case of it actually happening. The practice appears to be almost entirely a later literary invention, popularized by 19th-century novelists and illustrators working more than 100 years after the fact, dramatized further still by the earliest pirate films that followed. The real punishments this whole night has already walked you through: marooning, ear-slitting, a supervised duel ashore, straightforward flogging, were grim enough on their own without needing an invented plank to make the point. Reality, once again, turns out to need considerably less embellishment than the legend gave it anyway. One clause, more than any other, tends to unsettle modern readers when they first come across it, and it deserves honest treatment rather than a quick gloss over. Articles from multiple crews reportedly prohibited bringing women or boys aboard in any capacity connected to sex, on pain of death for the man responsible. Language that historians read less as a statement of enlightened principle, and more as another blunt, practical measure aimed at preventing exactly the kind of jealousy, violence, and division that could tear a crowded all-male crew apart from the inside. Whatever the underlying reasoning, the documented cases of women who did serve aboard pirate vessels of the era, a small handful, genuinely documented rather than legendary, having disguised themselves and fought as ordinary crew rather than in any other capacity, suggest the rule, where it existed, was interpreted narrowly enough to leave room for those exceptions. Though the record on exactly how consistently any of this was enforced across different crews remains thin and uneven. The exceptions to that rule, thin as the overall record is, happen to be some of the best documented individuals from the entire era, and they're worth naming specifically, rather than leaving as a vague aside. Anne Bonny and Mary Read both sailed, at the same time, Aboard the very ship the earlier story of Charles Vane's deposal eventually left in the hands of Calico Jack Rackham. Genuine, independently documented figures rather than folklore, their existence confirmed not by Johnson alone, but by the actual 1720 Jamaican court records from their trial. Both fought openly as crew during their final engagement, when Rackham's ship was surprised and captured by a government sloop off Jamaica in October of that year. Witnesses at the subsequent trial specifically testified that Bonny and Reed fought harder and longer than most of the men aboard, some of whom, by the same testimony, had already retreated below decks by the time the two women were still on deck exchanging fire. Both were convicted of piracy alongside the rest of the crew and sentenced to hang, and both escaped the gallows through the same legal mechanism. Each successfully pleaded her belly, the period's term for claiming pregnancy, which English law at the time recognized as sufficient grounds to delay an execution until after childbirth, on the reasoning that an unborn child shouldn't be punished for its mother's crime. Reed appears to have died in prison of a fever not long after. Before any further sentence could be carried out, Bonny's ultimate fate is more genuinely uncertain, with surviving records simply going quiet on what happened to her afterward, leaving room for exactly the kind of speculation that thrives wherever the documented trail runs out. Not every crew's articles survived intact from voyage to voyage. Either a ship lost to storm or battle meant the document itself was gone along with everything else, and a new crew assembled from survivors and fresh recruits would simply write a new one, adjusted to whatever lessons the old one's failures had taught. The articles, in that sense, were never quite finished, a living, working draft revised by necessity rather than a fixed sacred text. Exactly the kind of practical, unglamorous tinkering you'd expect from men who had no illusions about permanence in any part of their lives. What ties all of it together, the shares and the votes and the lights-out curfew and the compensation scale, is a single underlying fact worth sitting with as the bell rings again somewhere above and this night wears on. None of it was imposed from outside. No king, no admiralty court, no distant government official wrote a single word of it. It was built, article by article, crew by crew, by men the rest of the Atlantic world had already decided didn't deserve rights, protections, or a voice in their own fate. And rather than simply descending into the lawless chaos that word pirate still conjures for most people today, they built law anyway, imperfect and brutal in places, genuinely fair and forward-thinking in others, entirely their own. It rarely survived contact with a real crisis intact. Articles got bent, ignored, or rewritten under pressure more often than any romantic account likes to admit. Same as any human system of rules ever has. But the fact that men in this exact situation, on ships very much like the one you're standing aboard tonight, chose to write anything down at all, rather than simply ruling each other by force, says something quietly remarkable about what people build even at the very edges of the law, in the dark, with nothing but a quill, a mark, and each other to answer to. Somewhere below, the injured sailor Pell tended earlier has finally drifted off. His wound dressed, his 800-piece compensation already a settled matter of record, rather than a fight waiting to happen. That's the articles working exactly as they were meant to, quietly, unglamorously, in the dark, while everyone else's attention stays fixed on the horizon. The articles are a fine thing to have settled and sleeping below decks. They matter a great deal less in the next 10 minutes, because the lookout up the mast has just called down, and every man within earshot has gone very still. You feel the change before you understand the words. It's somewhere past midnight now, the deep, groggy stretch of the true night watch, and you're standing near the rail half listening to the water when the cry comes down from the masthead. Not loud, not panicked, but sharp enough to cut through the general creak and hum of the ship. A light, off the starboard bow, low on the horizon. You strain to see it, and for a long moment catch nothing but black water and stars. Then there it is, faint, steady, unmistakably a lantern rather than a star, riding low the way a ship's stern light does. Your stomach does something complicated. Excitement and dread aren't as far apart as you'd think, and standing here in the dark with a stranger's light glowing miles off across the water, you feel both of them arrive at exactly the same moment. The quartermaster is already moving, and so is the captain. For the first time all night, actual undisputed authority is about to matter, because everything from this point forward, whether to chase, how to close the distance, whether to fight or flee once contact is made, falls squarely and immediately under the captain's command. That's not tradition or habit. It's practically the entire reason the office of pirate captain exists at all, carved out of an otherwise power-sharing system specifically, because a ship in the middle of a chase or a fight cannot function with 40 men voting on each individual decision as it happens. Somebody has to say turn now, fire now, board now, and be obeyed instantly, without debate, or the moment is lost along with, quite possibly, everyone's life. For the length of tonight's chase, whatever it turns into, you're no longer part of a rough, shipboard democracy. You're part of a single machine, and the man giving the orders is the only one who gets to decide how it runs. Word travels fast and quiet through the ship. No bells rung in alarm. No shouting below to wake the off-watch crew before it's necessary, because the first and most valuable asset in a night chase like this one is the enemy's ignorance that you exist at all. Orders come down in low, clipped voices. Douse the stern lantern. Grote, still on his rounds from earlier, moves fast, pinching the wick and covering the lens rather than risk even the brief flare of extinguishing it outright. Within a minute or two, the ship that had been quietly announcing its position to the entire ocean goes properly dark, sailing under nothing but starlight, running as close to invisible as a wooden vessel with canvas sails can manage. This is the flip side of everything you learned earlier about lanterns as a kind of language. A light left burning says, "Here I am. All is well." A light deliberately, carefully extinguished says something the crew doesn't need spoken aloud. We are hunting, and we do not want to be seen doing it. By the time the ship has come about, angling to close the gap without giving away the approach, the whole crew is awake and moving. And you notice something you hadn't fully clocked before now, in the routine business of watches and lamps and articles. How quickly this loose, argumentative, dice-playing, occasionally mutinous company of men reorganizes itself into something close to silent, coordinated efficiency the moment there's an actual target on the water. Gun crews take their positions at the ship's cannon without needing to be told twice. Boarding axes and cutlasses get pulled from wherever they've been stowed and distributed, hand to hand down the line. Somewhere near the bow, the lookout who first called the sighting, the same man who spent every previous watch tonight clinging to a mast 80 feet above a rolling deck for the promise of first pick of the pistols, is being congratulated in low, tight voices by men who, an hour ago, were arguing with him over a dice game. Below and around you, the ship quietly rams itself for a fight that hasn't started yet and, with any luck, never will. Grappling hooks, iron, heavy, and lashed to short lengths of chain rather than rope so an enemy can't simply cut them free, get laid out along the rail within easy reach, ready to be swung and thrown the moment the two hulls close near enough to matter. Boarding axes, short and brutally practical, get handed down the line alongside cutlasses. A pirate crew's weapon of choice for close work below decks, where the cramped space and low overhead made a long naval-issue sword nearly useless and a short, heavy blade considerably more effective. Pistols get a final check, flints inspected, priming powder topped off from a horn kept dry specifically for this purpose, because a pistol that misfires at the critical second of a boarding action is worse than no pistol at all. It's a weapon that's already told the enemy exactly where you are without doing you any good in return. Beyond the ship's main cannon, smaller swivel guns, mounted on the rail itself, light enough to be pivoted and aimed by a single man, loaded with scrap iron, nails, or lead shot rather than a single solid cannonball, get their own quiet check tonight. Because their real purpose isn't to sink an enemy vessel at all. It's to sweep her open deck clear of defenders in the seconds right before boarding. And crews of the period seem to have valued them precisely, because a ship taken mostly intact was worth considerably more than one blown apart in a full broadside exchange. The crew has clearly done this before, and done it enough times that nobody needs to be told which task is theirs. A rough division has settled in without a single order given. Some men naturally drifting toward the gun crews at the cannon, others toward the rail with grappling hooks in hand, ready to be first across should it come to that. It's not formal military drill, nothing like the rigid gun deck choreography a Royal Navy crew trains into muscle memory under threat of the lash. It's closer to a practiced habit built collectively, voyage after voyage, prize after prize, by men who've simply learned what works and kept doing it. What happens next depends entirely on what that light turns out to belong to, and here is where the crew's approach reveals just how much of piracy, contrary to the popular image of cannon blazing and skull and crossbones flags snapping in the wind, actually ran on deception rather than violence. Pirate vessels of the period very rarely flew a Jolly Roger openly while closing on a potential target. Doing so would only warn the other ship to run or fight before the pirates had gotten close enough to make either option meaningless. Instead, crews commonly approached under false colors, flying the flag of whatever nation seemed most likely to put the target ship at ease. A friendly merchant flag, occasionally even the target's own national colors, deliberately deceptive and, in the maritime customs of the era, a widely accepted ruse so long as the true colors were run up before any actual shot was fired. Only in the final moments, once escape was already effectively impossible, would a captain order the false flag struck and the crew's actual banner raised. And even that flag varied enormously from ship to ship, rather than matching the single, standardized skull and crossbones most people picture today. Some documented pirate flags carried an hourglass, a none too subtle reminder that time was quite literally running out for whoever was looking at it. Others, like the flag associated with Bartholomew Roberts, reportedly showed the captain himself standing atop a pair of skulls, each one labelled with a set of initials believed to represent specific grudges against colonial officials in Barbados and Martinique, who'd sent warships hunting him, less a generic symbol of terror than something closer to a very pointed, very personal message aimed at two specific governors an ocean away. Tonight's ship, closing slowly through the dark under bare starlight and no lantern at all, isn't showing any flag yet, false or otherwise. There's nothing to show a flag to in this kind of darkness anyway, and the entire approach depends instead on staying unseen for as long as possible, then closing the last stretch of distance fast enough that the other vessel has no real chance to run even, once they finally spot you. It's a patient, nerve-wracking kind of hunting, closer in temperament to a poacher stalking prey through underbrush than the swashbuckling broadside-to-broadside battle the word pirate tends to conjure. Most encounters, historians studying surviving depositions from captured merchant crews generally agree, never came to a real fight at all. A merchant captain, informed by a boarding party that resistance was pointless against a heavily armed pirate crew already alongside, usually surrendered without firing a shot, correctly calculating that his cargo mattered less to him than his life, and that a crew practiced enough to reach this point without being seen coming was not a crew worth testing. There's a specific, almost ritualized moment that usually comes just before any of this turns into actual violence, and it's worth understanding because it explains why so many of these encounters ended without a shot fired in anger at all. Once a pirate vessel had closed near enough, the customary opening move, documented across numerous captured captains' own accounts of being taken, was a single warning shot, fired deliberately wide, across the target's bow rather than into her hull, a universally understood signal on the water of the period meaning, simply, heave to, strike your colors. And this doesn't have to get any worse than it already is. A shouted hail usually followed, sometimes from the quarterdeck through a speaking trumpet if the ship carried one, demanding the target identify herself and yield without further delay. What happened next was, in the coldest possible arithmetic, mostly a matter of the merchant captain doing quick math of his own. A handful of crew and maybe 2 or 4 small guns against a heavily armed vessel that had already demonstrated the patience and discipline to stalk him unseen through an entire night. Surrender, in that calculation, usually won. It's a strange thing to sit with, how much of this whole violent sounding trade actually ran on 2 crews silently agreeing, without ever quite saying so, that neither of them particularly wanted to die over a cargo hold full of sugar and timber. By the time the gap has closed to within easy hailing distance, close enough now that you can make out the other vessel's shape against the stars, smaller than your own ship, riding low in the water the way a merchantman does when she's carrying real cargo rather than sailing in ballast, a decision has already effectively been made, though nobody's spoken it aloud yet. This isn't going to be a fight. It's going to be a negotiation, with a cannon pointed at it. The order comes down the line in the same low voice as before. Run up the colors. Whatever flag this crew actually sails under, and the historical record makes clear it genuinely varied ship to ship, goes up the halyard in the dark. And somewhere aboard the other vessel, a lookout who's just spent the last several minutes with a slowly sinking feeling in his stomach, finally gets confirmation of exactly what he'd started to suspect. What happens in the next few minutes, whether this particular merchant crew surrenders quietly or tries something desperate, is a different stretch of the night than the one this chapter has time for. The actual boarding, the terrified faces of a captured crew, the frantic accounting of what's actually in the hold worth taking. All of it waits for its own telling on some other night. For now, notice only this: the entire elaborate machinery of tonight's chase, the doused lantern, the silent gun crews, the false stillness maintained right up until the final moment, existed for exactly one purpose. And it wasn't bloodshed. It was leverage, built patiently in the dark, so that when the moment finally came to reveal exactly who and what this ship was, the outcome would already be decided before a single shot needed firing at all. The small boats themselves, lowered and rowed across the last stretch of open water between the 2 ships, carry their own quiet tension that no amount of practiced routine ever fully erases. Oars muffled where the crews had the foresight to wrap them, rowers pulling low and steady rather than fast, because a splashing, hurried approach undoes half the careful patience of the whole night's silent chase in the final 30 seconds. Every man in that boat knows the 2 or 3 minutes crossing open water is, statistically, among the more dangerous stretches of the entire encounter. Close enough to be fired on, not yet close enough to fire back effectively. Entirely exposed. It passes without incident far more often than not. Tonight it passes without incident too. Assume for a moment the outcome the odds actually favor: the merchant captain, weighing his handful of crew and his 2 small guns against the ship bearing down on him, strikes his colors without a shot fired, and the boarding party goes across in the small boats a few minutes later. Cutlasses drawn, but mostly, at this stage, for show rather than immediate use. What follows isn't chaos so much as a practiced, almost clerical routine, and it circles right back to the same office that's run every other part of this night. The quartermaster, or a trusted hand acting on his authority, goes below into the captured vessel's hold with a lantern and begins the actual work of inventory, counting barrels, checking a captured cargo, manifest against what's physically there, separating what's worth taking from what isn't worth the space it would occupy aboard the already crowded pirate ship. The captured captain, meanwhile, stands on his own deck under guard, doing his best to look calm while doing the same anxious arithmetic every captain in his position has done before him. Whether cooperation buys his crew's safety, whether some hidden coin in his cabin will be found and held against him, whether this ends with his ship released to limp onward, or claimed outright as a new addition to the pirate fleet. Most nights, historians studying the surviving depositions generally agree it ends the plainer way, goods taken. Crew questioned briefly about news and other shipping in the area, perhaps a skilled tradesman or two pressed into service against his will, and the merchant vessel released to continue on, her captain considerably poorer and considerably more frightened, but alive, with a story he'll be retelling, with visible emotion, for the rest of his career. Somewhere behind you, as the two ships draw close enough now for voices to carry across the water, Corks turns the glass one more time, without anyone telling him to. Because some habits don't stop, just because the whole crew's attention is fixed on the darkness ahead instead. The bell doesn't ring this time. Nobody wants the sound carrying. But the sand keeps falling anyway, marking time the way it always has, indifferent to whatever's about to happen on the deck of a ship a few hundred yards away. Nights like this one, chase and capture, and a quiet dawn afterward, were the good outcome. Not every pirate crew's story ended with the sun coming up on a successful prize and a fair division of the take. Some ended the way Bartholomew Roberts did, fast, violent, and final, in the grey light, just before a different kind of morning entirely. It's the 10th of February, 1722, off Cape Lopez on the coast of what's now Gabon. And Bartholomew Roberts, the most successful pirate captain of the entire Golden Age by any measure historians can reconstruct, credited with taking somewhere between 400 and, by some more generous tallies, well over 400 prize vessels across a career that lasted barely 3 years, is standing on the deck of his flagship, the Royal Fortune, in a fine crimson damask waistcoat and breeches. A gold chain and diamond cross reportedly hung around his neck, pistols slung across his shoulders on a silk sling, in a manner Johnson's account describes with obvious relish. Bearing down on him out of the morning haze is His Majesty's ship Swallow, a 50-gun Royal Navy warship under Captain Challoner Ogle, sent specifically to hunt Roberts down after 2 years of mounting losses to shipping along the West African coast had made him, by that point, arguably the single most wanted man on the ocean. This is the story of the end of the Golden Age of Piracy itself, told through the death of the man historians generally consider its final, most successful, and in many ways most emblematic figure, and through what happened to the roughly 272 men taken prisoner alongside him, in a trial that would become, by the numbers alone, one of the largest criminal proceedings the Atlantic world had yet seen. Roberts hadn't planned to fight the Swallow that morning at all. Contemporary accounts, cross-checked reasonably well against naval records of the encounter, suggest his lookouts initially misidentified the approaching warship as a merchant vessel, a mistake that cost the Royal Fortune the head start she'd have needed to run. By the time the mistake became clear, Ogle's ship was already close enough to open fire, and in the first exchange of grape shot across the water, a single shot struck Roberts directly in the throat, killing him almost instantly on his own quarterdeck. What happened immediately afterward is one of those details that sits right on the boundary between documented fact and Johnson's evident flair for a dramatic scene. According to the account, in keeping with what Roberts had reportedly told his crew he wished done should he ever fall in battle, his body was weighted and thrown overboard by his own men before the Swallow could close the distance and take it, denying the Royal Navy the trophy of displaying his corpse, whether gibbeted in chains at some port as a warning to others, or simply paraded as proof of the kill. Whether Robert's exact final wish was recorded with total accuracy, or polished slightly for the page, the underlying fact of the burial at sea, mid-battle, by his own crew, appears in enough independent naval correspondence from the period that historians treat it as substantially reliable. The most feared captain on the West African coast vanished into the same ocean he'd spent 3 years terrorizing. And no grave, no body, no physical trace of him has ever been recovered. There's a sharp irony buried in exactly how Ogle's ship got close enough to manage that first fatal shot, and it's worth pausing on. Because it means the Swallow beat Roberts using precisely the same trick this whole night has already spent an entire chase teaching you. Roberts' squadron that morning actually consisted of 2 vessels, the Royal Fortune and a smaller consort ship. The Ranger and naval records of the engagement indicate Ogle deliberately used his own ship's approach to mislead them, initially appearing to withdraw rather than close for a fight, behavior calculated to look less like a warship spoiling for battle and more like a merchant vessel getting nervous and running for safety. The Ranger took the bait and gave chase, drawing her away from Robert's flagship entirely, at which point the Swallow turned, revealed her true strength, and made short, decisive work of the smaller ship before circling back 2 days later to find the Royal Fortune still at anchor. Her crew, apparently unaware their consort had already been destroyed. A false approach. A target lured away from safety by exactly the kind of deception a pirate crew itself might have used on a merchantman. The hunter, in the end taken down by a version of his own trade's oldest trick. Ogle himself was knighted afterward for the victory, becoming, by most naval historians' accounting, the only Royal Navy officer of the entire era to receive that particular honor specifically for an anti-piracy action. A measure of just how large a threat Roberts had genuinely become, and how much weight the Crown placed on finally ending him. The battle itself didn't end with Robert's death. His crew, leaderless and increasingly disorganized without him, fought on for a while longer before finally surrendering, and it's what happened to them afterward that turned this single naval engagement into something with far broader consequences for the entire era of piracy than one captain's death alone could have managed. Robert's crew, at the time of the Swallow's attack, numbered in the hundreds. Accounts vary, but figures around 270 men taken into custody across the engagement and its immediate aftermath appear consistently enough across surviving records to be treated as reasonably solid. They were transported to Cape Coast Castle, a British trading fort on the Gold Coast that also, grimly, served as a major hub in the transatlantic slave trade, and there, in April of 1722, put on trial in one of the largest piracy proceedings in British colonial history. The scale of it is worth sitting with for a moment. Historians who've studied the surviving trial records generally cite a figure around 52 men condemned to hang as a result of the Cape Coast Castle proceedings, a number that dwarfs almost every other single pirate trial of the era, reflecting just how large and how thoroughly documented Robert's crew had become by the time of his death. Dozens more were acquitted, their forced service status accepted by the court in exactly the way the ship's articles and the quartermaster's own record-keeping were designed to make possible. And a number of black crew members captured alongside the rest were, in a stark and separate injustice the trial record makes clear rather than glosses over, not tried under piracy law at all, but instead sold back into slavery. Their fate handled through an entirely different, entirely darker legal channel than the one their white and forced shipmates faced. It's a detail that resists the tidy, adventurous version of this story, and insists on being included anyway, because leaving it out would be its own kind of dishonesty about who actually lived and died and suffered through the real history behind tonight's romanticized watch and lantern and vote. London itself had its own particular ritual for marking the end of a pirate story, and it's worth knowing about. because it shaped how every man aboard tonight's ship understood exactly what capture would eventually mean. Pirates convicted in England were customarily hanged at a spot on the Thames called Execution Dock in Wapping, and the location was chosen with deliberate, grim precision, set at the low water mark specifically, so the gallows stood within the reach of the tide, under Admiralty jurisdiction rather than the ordinary criminal courts. Since piracy was legally defined as a crime committed on the high seas rather than on English soil, custom held that a condemned man's body should be left in place until 3 full tides had washed over it. A slow, public, repeated reminder rather than a single, quick spectacle, visible to every sailor rowing past on the busy river below. Crowds gathered for these hangings the way they gathered for any public execution of the period, and condemned men were expected, by a tradition nearly everyone involved seemed to take seriously, to deliver some final words from the scaffold. A confession, a warning to others, occasionally, if surviving accounts of a handful of these speeches are to be believed, something closer to defiance than repentance. It's this exact ritual, or a close colonial equivalent of it. Waiting at the far end of the same rope this crew's articles were written to make survivable in every other respect. The compensation scale, the fair shares, the vote, none of it was ever going to negotiate with a rope over the Thames or a scaffold at Newport. That particular ending sat entirely outside the system these men had built for themselves. The one thing no article, however carefully worded, could ever cover. Among those 270-odd men standing trial at Cape Coast Castle, the surviving court record shows a range of ages that's easy to forget when the story gets told as one about hardened outlaws alone. Several of the accused were recorded as 17, 18, 19 years old, boys barely into manhood who'd signed the articles, willingly or otherwise. Young enough that some historians studying the proceedings have noted the court itself seemed to weigh youth as a mitigating factor in at least a handful of the verdicts handed down. The trial also produced, as large pirate trials of the era commonly did, a number of crewmen willing to testify against their former shipmates in exchange for leniency, turning king's evidence. In the legal language of the time, a practice that comes with an obvious and uncomfortable cost, the same men who'd sailed under the same articles, drawn the same shares, stood the same watches side by side for months or years. In the end, facing a choice between loyalty to a crew that no longer existed in any meaningful sense, and their own single remaining chance to walk away alive. It's not a heroic detail, and nobody at the time pretended otherwise. It's simply what happens when the elaborate, improvised solidarity this whole night has spent its hours describing finally meets a court with the actual power of life and death, and the fragile system built out of votes and shared shares and written articles turns out to have no answer for that particular pressure at all. Robert's death and the mass trial that followed weren't an isolated event. They were the sharp edge of a broader, deliberate campaign that had been building for several years by 1722, and understanding its shape helps explain why tonight's ship, wherever exactly it's sailing, and whenever precisely this particular night falls, is operating on borrowed time, whether its crew fully grasps that yet or not. Woodes Rogers, a former privateer himself, had arrived in Nassau in the Bahamas back in the summer of 1718 as the newly appointed royal governor, carrying with him a king's pardon, a formal proclamation offering full amnesty to any pirate who surrendered and swore off the trade by a fixed deadline in September of that year. Several hundred men, exhausted, wanted, and increasingly aware that naval patrols were only going to grow more aggressive rather than less, took the offer and walked away from piracy entirely, at least for a time. Converting Nassau from the loosely governed pirate haven it had been into something closer to an ordinary, if still rough, colonial port, under Crown authority. The pardon didn't end piracy on its own, and the men who refused it, or who took it and drifted back to the trade within a year or two anyway, once the coin ran out, kept the naval patrols busy for years afterward. The pace and scale of the executions that followed only accelerated. In July of 1723, off Rhode Island, 26 men from the crew of a pirate captain named Charles Harris were hanged together at Gravelly Point, near Newport, in a single mass execution. By most historical accounts, the largest mass hanging in American history. A scale of state violence that dwarfs almost anything else the American colonies saw in that century. Pirate-related or otherwise, and one documented in enough contemporary newspaper accounts and colonial records, alongside the personal writings of the Puritan minister Cotton Mather, who ministered to several of the condemned men in their final days, that the event's basic facts are about as solid as anything from this whole story gets. 3 years later, in 1726, a captain named William Fly was hanged in Boston after a short, violent career, one of the last individually notable executions widely cited by historians as marking something close to the practical end of the classic Golden Age of Piracy as a going concern, the moment the mathematics of the trade finally tipped decisively in favor of the navies hunting it, rather than the crews practicing it. What all of it amounted to, across roughly a decade from Rogers' pardon in 1718 to Fly's hanging in 1726, was the methodical dismantling of exactly the world this whole night has spent its hours inside. The watches, the quartermaster's ledger, the articles and their compensation scale, the storm lamps and their careful fire discipline. The whole improvised, self-governing floating society built by men the wider world had already written off. It didn't end because piracy stopped being profitable, or because the men doing it stopped believing in whatever fragile fairness their articles had built. It ended because the empires whose shipping they'd been raiding finally decided the cost of hunting them down. Ship by ship, trial by trial, gallows by gallows, was worth paying. Roberts, in his crimson coat and his gold chain, thrown overboard by his own men in the grey light off Cape Lopez, marks about as clean an ending point as the historical record offers for the era at its peak. What came after, for the scattered crews still working the same waters this ship is working tonight, was less a golden age winding down gently than a slow, grinding, well-documented extermination, one captured crew and one crowded trial at a time. One more piece of this story's ending is worth knowing before the night closes, because it's the reason so much of tonight's telling has kept circling back to a single cautious phrase, according to Johnson, or as the account has it. 2 years after Roberts died off Cape Lopez in 1724, a book appeared in London titled A General History of the Pirates, credited to a Captain Charles Johnson, whose true identity historians still argue about to this day, some suspecting it may have been a pen name for someone else entirely, possibly even Daniel Defoe himself, though the case remains genuinely unsettled either way. Whoever actually wrote it, the book became an immediate, enormous commercial success, compiling and often dramatizing the lives of Roberts, Blackbeard, Bellamy, Vane, Bonney, Reed, and nearly every other name this night has mentioned, and in doing so, it became, almost single-handedly, the primary lens through which the entire English-speaking world has understood Golden Age piracy ever since. Plays, novels, and eventually films all drawing, whether their creators knew it or not, from one commercially motivated book written by an author who may never have set foot on a pirate ship at all. It's worth sitting with, one last time before this night ends, the storm lamps and the quartermaster's ledger, the articles nailed to the mast, the vote that made and unmade captains. All of it genuinely happened, corroborated across trial records and depositions independent of any single storyteller. But the colour and drama draped over so much of it, the swagger and the speeches, came substantially from one man's pen, writing for profit, 2 years after most of his subjects were already dead. and unable to correct the record. The dawn that broke over the Swallow and the royal fortune that February morning in 1722 wasn't the kind of dawn this night has been building toward. It's a different sunrise than the one waiting, eventually, for tonight's ship and tonight's watch. But it's the one that decided how many more nights like this one there were ever going to be, for anyone. Somewhere back aboard tonight's ship, none of that future has happened yet. It's still dark. The glass corks turned so many times tonight is still running, patient and indifferent. The same way it's run every half hour since the sun went down. The storm lamps are still burning low and amber behind their scraped hornpanes, exactly where Grote left them, exactly where they need to be if anyone's going to find their footing in the dark between now and dawn. Somewhere below, Wick has finally stopped crying and fallen asleep, his fair share of tonight's careful work already recorded. Safe, in a ledger a man who trusted him kept honestly. Somewhere off to the east, that same low, stacked bank of cloud is still sitting there. Patient, the kind every experienced hand aboard keeps half an eye on without quite admitting he's worried. Maybe it passes harmlessly by morning. Maybe. On some other ship, on some other night not so different from this one, it doesn't. The way it didn't for the 146 men who went into the water off Cape Cod in 1717, whose ship's bell sat quietly in the sand for 267 years before anyone found it, and finally read what it said. That's the whole of it, really. Everything this night has been circling since the first bell rang. A bronze bell, a turned glass, a ledger somebody kept honest by lamplight, and a document nailed to a mast because law, out here, had nowhere else to stand. Ordinary things, kept carefully, by ordinary men who built something resembling fairness out of driftwood and desperation, in a world that had already decided they didn't deserve either. You're warm right now. You're dry. Nobody is turning a glass over your head tonight, and nobody needs you to stand a watch before this is over. That's the whole difference between where you are and where this story just spent its hours, and it's worth letting that difference actually land as you drift off. The watches stood. The lamps are tended. Somewhere, a bell that hasn't rung in 300 years is finally quiet, resting exactly where the sea decided to leave it. You're warm. You're safe. Tonight, that's enough.